Enigma is a series of sculptures and poems and an electronics workshop that explores the enigma of electricity within everyday technical objects. Psychoanalytic scholar Gully Atlas describes the relationship between pragmatic and enigmatic, subjective and intersubjective experience. She writes, "Pragmatic elements are complex, verbal and nonverbal, and they can be observed, measured, and assessed. In comparison, the enigmatic aspects of subjectivity and intersubjectivity are complex and ambiguous, but much harder to put one's finger on at all, and even more difficult to identify or specify. They are opaque to observation, puzzling, riddled, polysemous, and often leave us with more questions than answers." My interest in electricity began with stepper motors. It actually began in physical computing first semester when Winnie and Chen Shan used a servo motor in a really elegant way for their midterm project. I had never seen servo motors used that way before. When I saw their motor and when I began working with servo motors and stepper motors after that, I felt a bit of magic happening. I had never connected to the way that physical computing is traditionally used, which is to create sensors that collect analog input typically coming from a human, and numerically map it to some digital outcome, or vice versa. I found that this method not only prevented me from having any sort of idea or dialogue of what was happening electrically, it also directed my attention away from the electricity and from the electrons. Seeing a motor move was my first taste of the enigmatic. There was something in that movement that I found to be irreducible by numbers, observation, or assessment. This is some of the work I made exploring stepper motors and the way that soft material moves. My interest in electricity grew through the exploration of radios, signal protocols, e-waste, and theories of the fetish. This led to a performance, a paper, a workshop, and poetry. During NIME, I created a piece called Motherboard, which was the same title I used for my final paper for my class, Theories of the Fetish. During this course, Theories of the Fetish, taught by Performance Studies Professor Barbara Browning, I began exploring the ways that the literal and the metaphorical are in tension, constantly rubbing up against each other, and at times confused and indistinguishable from each other. The queer studies theorist Jose Esteban Munoz writes on queerness and ephemera. While he did not write directly in conversation with Atlas or her theory of the enigmatic, I believe that his writing about the ephemeral expands its definition. He writes, "Queerness is rarely complemented by evidence, or at least by traditional understandings of the term. The key to queering evidence, and by that I mean the ways in which we prove queerness and read queerness, is by suturing it to the concept of ephemera. Think of ephemera as trace, the remains, the things that are left, hanging in the air like a rumor." While writing my final paper about the motherboard, I began writing poems on schematics. I was taking Pedro's Electronics for Inventors class, which introduced me to a catalog of amazing and ubiquitous analog circuits. During the course, I found it difficult to distinguish a clear point or moment between that which constitutes the digital and that which constitutes the analog. I became overwhelmed by reading schematics to breadboard the circuits, feeling the strictness and overdetermination of the marks in the diagrams, and so my search for the enigmatic language within them continued. Moving ahead to this current semester, my thesis journey, I want to mention a workshop that Looming and I led at the Tech for Social Good Day conference in February. It was about e-waste and how to desolder components from discarded vintage electronics. Looming and I defined a few discrete electronic components and their uses while participants unscrewed them. During our research, it became clear that electronics have been made to be thrown away, even at the level of component manufacturing, before they are soldered to circuit boards. Through this research and workshop, I was confronted again with the overdetermination of value and pragmatic use in electronics. And in this overdetermination, I tried to look for the places and opportunities for the enigmatic to emerge. These explorations allowed me to realize that electricity is complex and multifaceted, but most clearly I realized that pursuing my relationship with electricity as a pragmatic element of subjective experience, something that I can observe, measure, and assess, left me with a disjointed portrait of electricity. This approach was not helpful to my research and work, often leaving me with more questions than answers. These questions showed me that I need to approach electricity as an enigmatic element, something that can only be felt. I think of my thesis as a series of rituals that attempt to iterate the enigmatic. I asked myself to think about what electricity would look like if we could see it. What would it sound like? And how would it move? What would it say to us? These iterations aren't based on empirical data and measuring, but rather based on a series of ritual practices and repetitions of listening, both literally and figuratively, to the thing that turned my circuits on. These are some early sculptures I made during the thesis process. I started to play with the way discrete components are made through a combination of materials that vary in conductivity. Incorporated conductive materials like metal and non-conductive materials like fabric. I sometimes think of the sculpture on the left as a resistor and would like to attach it to a circuit board. This was an early idea about the enigmatic within electricity that I drew in my notebook while on the subway going to school around February. Connections refers to the signal pathways or traces on a circuit. If different signals on a circuit touch, it can lead to the circuit breaking or shorting. Because of coronavirus, I left New York to stay in Maine without my fabric and without a sewing machine. During this time, I worked on writing circuit poems, made more sculptures, and developed a workshop based on both. The circuits I used for the poems each held significance to me. They involved making sound, turning on motors, and forming basic digital logic. They are all analog circuits that are very simple and ubiquitous. I chose them because we interact with them every day, without typically realizing. One circuit, pulse width modulation, generates a specific variable signal that I find to be as interesting as the circuit layout itself. So I wrote on this signal diagram as well. By inserting words with a legible grammatical flow and sudden emotional tone, I'm attempting to call attention to the prescriptive determination of diagramming circuits, attempting to disrupt the notion that precision is devoid of gesture, the myth that there could be nothing lingering between the diagram of the circuit and the circuit itself, to disrupt the myth that all gestures and human meaning imbued in circuit diagrams are purely pragmatic, a literal translation of the material world into lines and shapes that literally represent that material towards pragmatics of ordering. By overlaying the diagrams with specific yet unclear grammatical confusion, I am calling attention to the fact that they are and always have been imbued with exactly these kinds of enigmatic traces. You could say that I am trying to dance on top of the page, to recall or summon the queer gesture that has otherwise been erased or concealed. I planned a pulse width modulation workshop, which asked participants to search for the enigmatic language in electronics through a series of ritual practices and engagements with the material's tactile qualities, rather than its conductivity or pragmatic function. In the workshop, participants are asked to create a variable resistor that changes the size of the pulse's width, which changes the way the signal sounds when attached to a speaker. While the variable resistor they make affects the PWM signal's sounding, I consider the interfaces they make as singular sculptures that could stand on their own, with or without their noise. I asked participants in the workshop to look for moments where the enigmatic may emerge. In my experience, ritual and performance can help us listen for the enigmatic. I give a few instructions like these here throughout the workshop to encourage participants to listen for the enigmatic by engaging with the material in a way they normally may not, and by using reflective practices through breathing and repetition. These are the printed boards I designed for the workshop, which produce a PWM, or pulse width modulation signal. The workshop is still in progress, and I am excited to send it out to participants to complete in the coming months. I feel a sense of the enigmatic in my favorite artworks, and I consider it the responsibility of the artist to recognize the ways in which the pragmatic may not be enough, and listen to and open up ways for the enigmatic to emerge where it can be with us. This has been my goal in the thesis project, and towards its end, after quite a bit of listening while in quarantine, I produced these sculptures. After 2 years of bending wires to fit on breadboards, I've begun to engage with the material in a way that I usually have not. And while my work with electricity certainly is not finished, and while I know that it may never be finished, I hope that these works are able to touch something of the enigmatic and remember something of the ephemeral.